Well, we come to the third beatitude. We've looked at several sermons already in the Sermon on the Mount, or about the Sermon on the Mount. But tonight we want to look at the third beatitude. The third beatitude, of course, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And in this beatitude, as we have previously noted, the beatitudes are not unconnected. They are a flow of thought, and they help us to understand how to find true and lasting happiness. So they build one upon another, and you begin with and they are a logical sequence. You begin with poor in spirit. Remember, we talked about the poor in spirit, that it's more than just being humble, but it's actually having poverty of the inner person. And as we stand before God and we see His magnificence and we see His greatness, we see what a wonderful God we serve. Are we not humbled by that? Do we not feel poverty of spirit by that? I hope that we do. But then that leads us to mourn over our own sin. We see the greatness of God. We see His perfect character. We see the sinlessness of God. But then we look at self and we see ourselves and how poor we are, and we mourn over our sin. And so it comes to then being meek. And meekness really is submission to the will of God. And I've seen definitions of meekness, and the one that I always think about, although there are really several different characteristics, and we'll look at some of those different things, but the characteristic that really stands out in my mind, at least, is the one that it submits to the will of another. Meekness submits to the will of another. Rather than looking at our own will and trying to do our own will, we then are willing to submit to the will of somebody else. And in this case, because we see how great God is, we see how lowly we are, we then mourn over our sin, but then we submit to the will of God, because we mourn over our sin. So we're going to look at meekness in three ways, or the blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, in three ways. The first is we'll look at what meekness is and is not. And we're actually going to begin with is not and then is. And then we're going to look at some examples of meekness, and finally conclude with the rewards of meekness, the latter part of the verse. So let's then begin with what meekness is and is not. And as I said, we're going to look at what it is not first. Well, like poor in spirit and like mourning, we pointed out that poor in spirit and mourning is about spiritual qualities. It's not about physical or normal qualities of a person or the normal characteristics of a person. It's about the spiritual characteristics. It is not a natural quality. In many ways, the world admires aggression. They admire conquest. But the true Christian, he admires and tries to be meek. The world trusts in its own organizations. The world trusts in its own institution. The world trusts in its own military might. And I know as an American, we sometimes look at our own country and we think we have the strongest country in the world. Well, other countries thought that in the past, and they failed. I mean, look at the Roman Empire. Look at the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar and others like that. They were great military strengths and mights. But not so with Christians. We don't look for things like that. We don't trust in such things as that. The true Christian trusts solely in God. The world's confidence is in greatness. The world's confidence is in power. The world's confidence is in strength. But again, the Christian is meek. He's meek, and his confidence is in God. Now notice this application, and remember this being said to the Jews of Jesus' day. The Jews in the first century, they looked for a Messiah that would bring about military power, that would bring about a materialistic kingdom. And yet Jesus said, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And notice this also another application. I remember several years ago, and in the place where we were living, the largest church in the Metroplex area. And one of the ministers of that church wrote a series of articles that it was bigger is better. Well, is bigger better? Well, if we trust in the things of this world, bigger might be better. But it's not necessarily so. Now, Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek." Next, meekness is not indolence. Indolence is the inclination to laziness. And a person may be too lazy to stand for himself or to stand up for what's right, but by such have the appearance then of being meek. Is that what meekness is? Well, of course not. He appears to be humble and meek, looking to the things of others, when in reality he's just too lazy to take a stand, too lazy to make the preparations in order to take a proper stand. That's not meekness. That's just being lazy. Then a third idea that meekness is not is being easygoing. Well, there are some people that are easygoing, no doubt about it. But that doesn't mean they're meek. Because they are easygoing, they are likable people, they let others walk over them, and they even let others take advantage of them. But again, this only has the appearance of meekness. It's not true meekness. Meekness is not just being nice. There are easygoing and nice animals. Although, just the other day I was somewhere, and I don't remember where, whether it was out walking or whatever it is. And this happens quite often where they'll say, somebody's walking a dog and they'll say, "Oh, he's not mean," and the dog's ready to bite off my leg. Or they want to sniff me. And I finally told one fellow, he said, and the dog did appear to be a nice dog and wanted to be petted. And I said, "Sir, I just don't want to smell like a dog. Please get the dog away." It's just that simple. Well, there are nice animals, no doubt about it. But does that make them meek? Of course not. Some people seem to always be nice. And in fact, you've met, as I have, nice people that are syrupy nice. But again, does that necessarily make them meek? No, not necessarily. We appreciate sincere, nice people. We appreciate sincere dispositions of niceness, but meekness is far greater than that. Next, meekness is not the spirit of compromise. You can have a meek spirit and never compromise, never give in, never back down. So it's more than just simply that spirit of compromise. Such a spirit is made in statements like and portrayed in statements like peace at any cost. Is that really what we want? Peace at any price, any cost? No, I don't think so. A person who avoids conflict and disagreements is often regarded as meek. And I think about different ones, and it came up the other day, someone that said something about a couple that said they never fight. Well, I knew a couple years ago, and they're an older couple. In fact, I preached his funeral, and they said they never fought. And I said, "Really?" I said, "You never have a disagreement?" "Well, yeah, we have a disagreement." "Well, okay. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about fist and cuffs. We're not talking about going to a boxing ring. We're talking about, settling differences." Well, couples have those different things like that. But sometimes meekness is involved, and sometimes it's not. Well, meekness is also portrayed as weakness. It is portrayed sometimes as a weak, helpless lamb. However, meekness is compatible with strength, and it's also compatible with authority. So it's not just simply giving in and being weak. A person can be a great defender of the truth and still be meek. He might have to take a stand that's strong and that's mighty, but he can take that stand and still be meek. And meekness is not simply an outward manner. Often meekness is portrayed as staying the angry blow. However, meekness stems from the inner self and is an inward spirit. It is not just simply staying the angry blow. It is also staying the angry spirit within. And so what is meekness? Well, it begins with an attitude about self. And again, notice the context. A person cannot be meek without first being humbled by the greatness of God and without mourning over sin. He sees how sinful he is and how weak he is in the presence of how great and mighty God is. He mourns over his sin, and then he's in his sinful state, and then he is meek. Meek is void of pride. It's realizing that because of our sinfulness, we have nothing which to boast or which to flaunt. James said in James 4 and verse 6, "But he giveth grace, or giveth more grace, wherefore he saith, God resisteth the proud and giveth grace to the humble." And meekness is not demanding one's right. In Romans, the 14th chapter, and you remember that in Romans 14, Paul dealt with eating meats sacrificed to idols, whether we should eat them or not. And then he went on to say in verse 21, "It is good neither to eat flesh, nor to drink wine, nor anything whereby thy brother stumbleth, or is offended, or is made weak." Well, when you look at that particular passage, then that simply reflects upon that person who is meek. He's willing to submit to another, even though he has every right to eat the meat himself. Every right. And Paul noted that, what's an idol? It's nothing. I mean, they call them gods, but they're no god. They're nothing. And so what is meat sacrificed to idols? They're nothing either. And so we have the right to stand up. But then he said, don't offend your brother. Don't allow that meat to offend others. And I think about a fellow that I know, a gospel preacher, and he got into a debate with another gospel preacher over whether we can celebrate Christmas in the church building. And he just really stood on his ground and he would not give in. And I thought, and he kept using Romans 14, and I thought, you've missed the whole point of Romans 14. It's not standing up for your rights. It's allowing the opinions of others to give in to the will of another. But then meekness continues with a proper attitude towards self. Now, I think there's a number of ways that we can point this out, but it's the meek person that's gentle and mild and lowly. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1, Paul wrote, "Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted." You see, it's that attitude that we have with reference to other people. How are we going to treat them? We have to treat them with meekness. We must be meek as we try to save that soul from falling into sin. The meek person also does not have a spirit of retaliation, but follows the spirit of the golden rule. You remember Matthew 7, verse 12? Therefore all things, whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them. For this is the law and the prophets. Meekness carries with it the attitude of patience and long-suffering, especially suffering for unjust reasons. Peter said in 1 Peter 2, verses 21 and 23, he said, For even hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that ye should follow in his steps, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth, who, when he was reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judgeth righteously. Christ suffered for unjust reasons. He went to a mock trial. He went to the cross. He suffered not because he had committed some sin, not because he had committed some crime. He did not. He was perfect in every way. But he did not retaliate. But then meekness also ultimately culminates in a proper attitude toward God. It is the attitude of God's will, not mine. And I believe that illustrates then the point that I was making, the description that I used, that is submitting to the will of God. In John 6 and verse 38, Jesus said, For I came down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him that sent me. It is the attitude of servitude toward God, that penetrating question that Jesus asked in Luke 6 and verse 46. And why call ye me Lord, Lord, and do not the things which I say? It is putting God first above all else and above others. The man came, the scribe came to Jesus, and he heard them reasoning together and perceived that he had answered them well, talking about the Pharisees, and asked him, Which is the first commandment of all? And Jesus answered him, The first of all the commandments is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind, and with all thy strength. This is the first commandment. And the second is like, namely this, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. That's through verse 31. And so it is. Meekness is that attitude toward God, that we're going to put his will above our own will. Now let's look at some examples of meekness. The first one I chose is that of Abraham. And this is found in Genesis chapter 13. And there was a dissension that arose between the herdsmen of Abraham and the herdsmen of Lot. Now you remember that Lot was Abraham's nephew. And that Abraham, because Lot's father died, Abraham raised up Lot like a son. And Lot must have been almost like a son. And yet when that dissension came, Abraham went to Lot. Now you would have thought that Lot, being the younger one, would have went to Abraham, but that's not the case. Abraham went to Lot. And basically Abraham said, if you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. And you know, when Abraham could have, Abraham was like a father to Lot. Abraham was the older of the two. Abraham could have said, I'm the older, I'm your father, I'm the one that ought to choose which way to go. But that's not the attitude that Abraham had. Abraham was meek, and he allowed Lot to choose the direction. And sad to say, Lot made the poor choice of going to Sodom and Gomorrah. Of all the places Lot could have chose, he chose Sodom and Gomorrah. How sad. Another example is that of Moses. And in fact, in Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3, the Bible says, Now the man Moses was very meek, above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. Now that's how meek Moses was. And he was meek because he humbled himself and submitted to the will of God. Yeah, at the beginning, he made all kinds of excuses at the burning bush of why he couldn't lead Egypt or go back to Egypt and lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. But he ultimately submitted to the will of God. But also, think about this. He saw the wealth of Egypt. And he saw what it meant to be the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And you think about the grandson of someone great and one of the greatest political leaders of that particular time. And you're the grandson of that particular leader. Now, what would you have? Probably just about anything you wanted. And yet, Moses chose the reproach of Christ and to be with the people of God. That's meekness. And also we look at Jeremiah. Now he spoke the truth, and it was like a fire shut up in his bones. But when you read the book of Jeremiah, that's Jeremiah 20 and verse number 9. But when you read the book of Jeremiah, you know, he tried to quit. And God said, they won't listen, but you continue to preach. And I've always found that interesting. Jeremiah was sent to preach to a people that would not listen. And they did not listen. And when he tried to quit, and God told him they won't listen, but you go ahead and preach, what did Jeremiah do? In meekness, he submitted to the will of another. In chapter 5 and verse number 31, the other prophets spoke falsely. They were tickling ears. They were telling people what they wanted to hear. And we go out into the world, and sad to say, even of our own brethren, that's what we find oftentimes. But we must preach the truth. We might not be eloquent at it. We might not be the best speakers there are, but we must preach the truth. And we're not going to have a good reputation among some brethren, but we must preach the truth. And that's the attitude that Jeremiah had. In meekness, he kept on preaching and teaching. Though discouraged, he would not quit. Another example, one from the New Testament, is that of Paul. And I chose 2 Corinthians 4, verses 8 through 10 to illustrate this particular point that Paul put God first in his life. He suffered at the hands of the world, no doubt, but he also suffered at the hands of brethren. In 2 Corinthians 4, verses 8 through 10, there Paul wrote, "We are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not despaired. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Cast down, but not destroyed. Always bearing about in the body the dying of the Lord Jesus, that the life also of Jesus might be made manifest in our bodies." Well, to accomplish Christ proclaimed the mission for his followers, for Christians, to evangelize the world. Paul, in meekness, traveled much of the known world in his day. And you know, it's not like getting in the car and driving a few hundred miles or getting into an airplane and flying a few thousand miles. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about getting into cargo ships and all the hardships that would come upon you with that. And then to be shipwrecked and to continue on and not stop, never discouraged. And then being put into prison. But you know, I've always said, I'm thankful that Paul was in prison, because he probably would have never taken the time to write the epistles that he wrote if he had not. You know, it didn't stop the work. He just focused a little differently. That's all. He humbled himself. and totally submitted himself to God. And Jesus, of course, is our supreme example. Can you hear the meekness of Jesus when he said, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." That's Matthew 11:28-30. In meekness, he was on the cross, and he looked out at the crowd round about him, and he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And even at that breath, they parted his garments and cast lots. That's Luke 23:34. Then in Philippians chapter 2, verses 3-8, very well-known passage, him being in the form of God, thought it not a robbery to be equal with God, but emptied himself, became a servant, like you and I, became a servant. He submitted to the will of God, even upon the cross. And each of these examples, submitted to the will of another. And so every single one of them really illustrates that particular point. Well, finally, let's look at the rewards of meekness. Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Now, there are different things that different commentaries say about inheriting the earth and what it might mean. And I wrote down 3 that I think that this could be a reference to. And I don't think it's any one of these 3, but a combination of all 3 of these. And so meekness then, inheriting the earth then, is first, the meek are satisfied and content with the things of this world. Now, a number of passages illustrate that. And Psalm 37 and verse 11, I believe it is probably what Jesus was quoting when he said this particular thing. He said, "But the meek shall inherit the earth, and shall delight themselves in the abundance of peace." In 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 10, there Paul wrote, "As sorrowful, yet always rejoicing, as poor, yet making many rich, as having nothing, and yet possessing all things." And so, Paul had the attitude of being satisfied with the things of this world. We know the temporary. We know that they're going to pass away. We know that they're going to be destroyed one day. And so we must be satisfied. And I believe that's what inheriting the earth probably has reference to. As often we sing, as I've quoted before, "This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue." In Philippians, the 4th chapter and verse 18, Paul wrote back to the church at Philippi. Now remember, on his second missionary journey, he planted that congregation in Philippi. And it appears by all appearances, because of the we sections in the book of Acts, that he left Luke behind in Philippi to take care of the church. And the church then took care of him. And he wrote back and he says, "I have all and abound. I am full, having received of Epaphroditus the things which were sent from you, an odor of a sweet smell, a sacrifice acceptable, well-pleasing to God." You see, true wealth and the enjoyment of earthly things belong to those who are meek. And I believe that's part of the point that Jesus made in this particular thing. It belongs to those who are meek, rather than those who spend their years, spend their time, spend their energy trying to acquire wealth. The meek also enjoy their temporal pleasures and are not burdened by their always changing character. I remember in my 20s going back home, where the little town that I grew up in, thinking that it would be the same. And you know what? It was never the same. Every year we go back and it changed just a little bit more. We go back now and it just doesn't even feel like home anymore. Especially since my parents do not live there anymore. But it's always changing character. We long for the permanent. And while the world selfishly pursues possessions, but they are never satisfied, we realize the temporal nature of them, and we inherit the earth because we do. I'm reminded of a man that came to Jesus. He was having a quarrel with his brother, of all people. And you know, they were quarreling over the inheritance from their parents. You remember what Jesus said? Now, this is found in Luke, the 12th chapter, and verse 15. But I think it's a passage that we all ought to always remember. Jesus said, "Take heed, beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth." Another thought concerning inheriting the earth is that all things ultimately belong to Christians. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 21 through 23, Paul wrote, "Therefore let no man glory in men. For all things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or things present or things to come. All are yours. Ye are Christ's, and Christ is God's." So Paul made it pretty clear. The things of this world belong to us, even though that we might not have control over them in some of the things, but they ultimately belong to God. In other words, God created the world not for the people of the world, but for His children. We shall possess the earth. And a third thought that some have said, that the meek will inherit the new earth. Now, the new earth doesn't mean a renovated earth like different denominational groups talk about. And it is interesting that you look at the word new there. It's absolutely new. And actually, the word can be used with reference to fresh fruit. Now, if it's a renovated new, then can you imagine going to the supermarket and buying some renovated fresh fruit? I don't know about you. That's not what I want. It kind of reminds me of the ABC gum. You remember when you were a kid and you offered the ABC gum already been chewed? That's what it meant. Well, you know, that's renovated. That's not what we're looking for. But we're talking about something that is absolutely new in every way. Paul said it this way to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 2. "If we suffer, we shall also reign with Him. If we deny Him, He will also deny us." But we're going to reign with Him. We're going to reign with Him in the new heavens and the new earth. In Romans chapter 8 verse 17, Paul wrote, "But if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ, if so be that we suffer with Him, that we may be glorified together also." There it is. That's what we're looking for. And that's the promise that Jesus gave. If we will humble ourselves, if we will mourn over our sin, if we will approach God with meekness to do and to submit to His will, then the promise of the new heaven and new earth will be ours. Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Now there's a question that we must ask. And the question is simple. Are you meek? It's a question that every single one of us have to ask. Do you model yourself after the example of Jesus? Or the opposite is, are you self-willed? Do you submit to the will of God? Or do you only submit to your own will? Remember, Jesus said, "For whosoever exalteth himself shall be abased, And he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. Luke 14 and verse 11. Are you subject to the invitation this evening? If so, we invite you to come as together we stand and sing to encourage you.